In the final months of World War II, as the Third Reich began to crumble under the weight of its own ambitions, a strange and revealing drama unfolded behind the front lines, one that had nothing to do with tanks or artillery, but everything to do with pride, perception, and the illusion of honor. For decades, German military culture had cultivated a powerful image of itself. Officers of the Wehrmacht, and even more so the elite ranks of the SS, were raised to believe they belonged to a warrior aristocracy. They studied not only tactics and strategy, but also tradition, Prussian codes of conduct, rigid hierarchies, and an unshakable belief in the dignity of rank. To them, war was not just violence, it was a stage upon which honor was performed. Even in defeat, they expected that this image would endure. Many of these men had grown up in a system that glorified discipline and obedience above all else. From early training, they were taught that rank was sacred, that a general's authority extended beyond the battlefield, and that respect was not something earned in the moment, it was something permanently attached to their insignia. A salute was not merely a gesture, it was recognition of a social order that they believed transcended the chaos of war. This mindset followed them even as their armies disintegrated. By the spring of 1945, German forces were collapsing on all fronts. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines were shattered, and millions of soldiers had already been captured. Yet among many high-ranking officers, there remained a stubborn belief that they were still part of a gentleman's war. They imagined that their enemies, particularly the Western Allies, would recognize their status, treat them as equals, and honor the traditions of professional soldiers. So when these generals and SS commanders began surrendering to American forces, they often did so not as broken men, but as figures clinging to an identity that no longer matched reality. Some arrived in well-maintained staff cars, their uniforms still pressed, their boots polished. They carried themselves with the same rigid posture they had held in command, expecting that their authority would be acknowledged even in captivity. There are documented accounts of captured German officers insisting on maintaining strict hierarchies within prisoner-of-war camps. They expected to be separated from lower-ranking soldiers, to be given private quarters, and to be addressed according to their rank. Some even demanded that American guards salute them, as if the mere fact of their former position still commanded respect. To understand this behavior, it's important to recognize how deeply ingrained these beliefs were. The German officer corps had long seen itself as distinct from ordinary soldiers, a class apart. Even as the Nazi regime rose to power and reshaped the military, this sense of elitism remained. For SS officers in particular, the ideology went even further. They were not just soldiers, they were told they were the embodiment of a superior order, defenders of a so-called master race. This belief did not vanish overnight, even when the war was clearly lost. But when these expectations met the reality of American military culture, the result was immediate and jarring. The United States Army operated on a very different set of values. While rank and discipline were certainly important, there was a more practical, less ceremonial approach to authority. American soldiers were not raised in centuries-old aristocratic traditions. Many came from civilian backgrounds where hierarchy existed but did not define a person's inherent worth. Respect in the American system was tied to behavior and circumstance, not just insignia. In American POW camps, procedures were guided by international law, particularly the Geneva Conventions, but also by a straightforward sense of order and efficiency. Prisoners were to be processed, housed, and managed, not indulged. While officers were sometimes granted certain privileges in accordance with the conventions, these were limited and regulated. They were not invitations to recreate the rigid social structures of the German military inside captivity. This fundamental difference created a cultural clash that neither side had fully anticipated. German officers often interpreted the lack of ceremonial respect as a personal insult.
When American guards failed to salute them or address them without the expected formalities, it was seen as a deliberate affront to their honor. To the Americans, however, it was simply standard procedure. They were under no obligation to reinforce the very hierarchy that had fueled the enemy's war machine. There are accounts of tense early interactions where German officers would correct American guards on protocol, insisting on proper forms of address. In some cases, they attempted to issue orders within the camps, organizing other prisoners according to rank and expecting compliance. But American personnel quickly made it clear that such authority no longer existed. Within the barbed wire of a POW camp, the old system was irrelevant. This was more than a disagreement over etiquette. It was a collision between two fundamentally different worldviews. For the German officers, maintaining their dignity was a way of preserving identity in the face of defeat. If they could still command respect, still be treated as gentlemen of war, then perhaps the collapse around them was not total. Perhaps they could still believe that they had fought honorably, that they were part of something noble rather than something deeply compromised. But for American soldiers, many of whom had seen the brutal realities of the war firsthand, these expectations often seemed detached from reality. They had fought through devastated towns, encountered fierce resistance, and begun to hear reports, soon to be confirmed, of atrocities committed under the very system these officers represented. The idea of extending special respect to such figures did not sit easily. But at this stage, the full extent of that moral reckoning had not yet fully surfaced. What existed instead was a growing tension, an unspoken question hanging in the air. What did honor mean, and who deserved it? In these early encounters, the illusion of a gentleman's war was still intact, at least in the minds of those who had built their identities around it. They stood on one side of a cultural divide, expecting recognition of a world that was rapidly disappearing. On the other side stood American soldiers, grounded in a more pragmatic reality, unwilling to play a role in preserving that illusion. It was a quiet conflict at first, expressed in gestures not given, expectations unmet, and conversations that revealed just how far apart these two perspectives truly were. But beneath the surface, something deeper was beginning to shift, because soon the war would reveal truths that would make the idea of a gentleman's war impossible to sustain. By the time the spring of 1945 arrived, the war in Europe was no longer a question of who would win, but how it would end. The once formidable war machine of Nazi Germany was collapsing in every direction. Allied forces pressed in from the west, while the Soviet army advanced relentlessly from the east. Cities that had once symbolized power and control were reduced to rubble, and the illusion of permanence that had defined the Third Reich began to dissolve into chaos. For many high-ranking German officers, however, surrender did not immediately bring acceptance of defeat. Instead, it revealed a striking disconnect between reality and perception. Even as their nation crumbled, some continued to behave as though they were participants in a structured, honorable conflict, one governed by rules, mutual respect, and professional courtesy. When these generals and SS commanders approached American lines to surrender, the contrast could be almost surreal. Eyewitness accounts describe officers arriving in clean uniforms, some still wearing decorations earned earlier in the war, their posture rigid, their demeanor controlled. In some cases, they traveled in staff cars, accompanied by aides, as if they were reporting for a formal meeting rather than capitulating after a catastrophic defeat. They carried with them documents, maps, and carefully prepared statements, expecting the surrender to follow a certain script. In their minds, this was a transition from one phase of military life to another, not the end of their authority, but a change in its context. They believed they would be treated as professional equals by their captors, recognized for their rank and experience. What followed instead was something far less accommodating. American forces, focused on efficiency and security, processed prisoners with little regard for ceremony. Weapons were confiscated, personal items were inspected, and prisoners were directed to holding areas with clear, direct instructions. The atmosphere was not one of negotiation or mutual acknowledgement, but of control. The war, as far as the Americans were concerned, was still ongoing until the last formal surrender was completed. This gap between expectation and reality quickly became evident. There are documented instances where German officers, upon entering captivity, attempted to assert their rank immediately. They would introduce themselves by title, expecting recognition and, in some cases, deference. Some even expressed surprise or irritation when American soldiers did not respond with the formalities they were accustomed to. The absence of a salute, the casual tone of communication, the lack of visible distinction between officers and enlisted prisoners, all of it challenged their deeply held assumptions. Within the growing network of American POW camps, these tensions became more pronounced. The camps were often filled rapidly, sometimes with thousands of prisoners arriving in a short span of time. Among them were soldiers of every rank, from privates to generals. While the Geneva Conventions allowed for certain distinctions, such as officers not being required to perform manual labor, the overall structure of the camps did not replicate the rigid hierarchy that German officers expected. Instead, the priority was order and manageability. German officers, accustomed to command, often tried to recreate their authority within the camps. They would organize fellow prisoners, assign roles, and attempt to maintain discipline according to their own standards. In some cases, they even expected American guards to cooperate with this internal hierarchy, treating senior officers differently in daily interactions. But this expectation was only partially met, and often only in the most basic regulated ways. American personnel made it clear that while international law would be followed, the camps were under U.S. control, not German command. Orders came from American officers, not from captured generals. The chain of command that had once defined these men's lives no longer had any real power. It existed only as a memory, something they could attempt to preserve among themselves, but not enforce beyond that limited space. For many of these officers, this was the first real indication that their world had fundamentally changed. Yet even then, the belief in a kind of mutual respect lingered. Some German officers held on to the idea that, as professional soldiers, they shared a bond with their American counterparts. They believed that beneath the politics and ideology, there was a common understanding, a recognition of discipline, sacrifice, and leadership that would transcend the outcome of the war. But this belief sometimes led to moments of awkward interaction. There are accounts of German generals attempting to engage American officers as equals, discussing strategy, reflecting on battles, or even expressing admiration for certain aspects of the Allied campaign. In their minds, these exchanges were natural, part of the unspoken code of professional soldiers. But the responses they received were often reserved, distant, or entirely absent. American officers, while not universally hostile, were increasingly aware that the conflict they had fought was not simply a conventional war between equal powers. Reports were beginning to circulate, stories of atrocities, of systematic brutality, of actions that went far beyond the accepted norms of warfare. These reports had not yet reached their full, undeniable clarity, but they were enough to create a growing sense of unease. As a result, the idea of easy camaraderie between former enemies became harder to sustain. The German officers, still holding on to their self-image, often failed to grasp this shift. They interpreted the lack of warmth as a breach of etiquette rather than a reflection of deeper moral concerns. To them, the war had been fought according to a certain framework, and now that it was ending, that framework should reassert itself. But for the Americans, the framework itself was beginning to be questioned. Inside the camps, daily life continued with a kind of uneasy routine. Prisoners were counted, fed, and housed. Guards maintained order, following procedures designed to handle large numbers of captives efficiently. On the surface, everything functioned as expected, but beneath that surface, the psychological tension continued to build. German officers watched as their authority diminished with each passing day. Small details reinforced this reality. Being directed by younger soldiers, being grouped without regard to former status, being denied the gestures of respect they had once taken for granted. Each moment chipped away at the identity they had carried for so long. And yet, many still believed this was temporary. They told themselves that once the war formally ended, once the chaos settled, their status would be acknowledged again, that history would remember them not as defeated figures, but as professionals who had done their duty, that the concept of a gentleman's war would ultimately survive, even if only in retrospect. What they did not yet fully understand was that events were unfolding that would redefine the entire meaning of the war, events that would strip away any remaining illusion of honor and replace it with something far more difficult to confront. And when those truths became impossible to ignore, the fragile expectations these men still held would begin to collapse completely.
In early April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into central Germany, the war began to reveal a reality that many soldiers had not fully understood until that moment. The fighting had been brutal, the losses immense, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to encounter just beyond the front lines. Near the small town of Ohrdruf, American troops made a discovery that would mark a turning point, not just in the war, but in how it would be remembered. What they found was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. There were no opposing forces, no defensive positions, no signs of an organized military engagement. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the evidence of something far more disturbing. Ohrdruf was a concentration camp, one of many. But for the American soldiers who entered it, it was the first of its kind they had seen. The scene was overwhelming. Emaciated bodies lay where they had fallen, some left unburied, others hastily covered in shallow graves. Survivors, barely able to stand, moved slowly through the camp, their faces hollow, their bodies reduced to fragile outlines of what they once were. Buildings that might have appeared ordinary from a distance revealed their true purpose upon closer inspection, places of confinement, suffering, and systematic neglect. There were signs that the camp's operators had attempted to conceal what had taken place. Structures had been burned, records destroyed, and in some areas, bodies had been deliberately arranged in an effort to hide the scale of the atrocities. But the effort had been incomplete, rushed in the face of the advancing Allied forces. What remained was more than enough to expose the truth. For the soldiers who walked through Ohrdruf, the experience was not just shocking, it was disorienting. The war they had been fighting suddenly felt different. This was no longer just a conflict between armies, no longer a matter of strategy and territory. It was something deeper, something that challenged the very idea of what the enemy represented. Officers and enlisted men alike struggled to process what they were seeing. Some recorded their reactions in diaries. Others spoke of a quiet, heavy anger that settled after the initial shock. There was a sense that a line had been crossed, one that could not be explained by the usual language of war. Shortly after the discovery, high-ranking Allied commanders were brought to the site. Among them was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He understood immediately the significance of what had been found, not just as evidence of crimes, but as something that needed to be witnessed, documented, and remembered. Eisenhower insisted that others come to see it as well. He wanted journalists, members of Congress, and additional military personnel to witness the camp firsthand. He recognized that the scale and nature of what had occurred might be difficult for people to believe without direct evidence. This was not something that could be fully conveyed through reports alone. For Eisenhower, the visit to Ohrdruf was deeply impactful. He later described the experience in stark terms, making it clear that what he had seen went beyond anything he had expected. The discovery reinforced a growing realization among Allied leadership. The war they were fighting was not simply against a military force, but against a system that had carried out acts of extreme brutality on a massive scale. This realization began to change attitudes almost immediately.
The earlier interactions with captured German officers, those moments marked with tension but still framed within a kind of professional distance, started to take on a different meaning. The idea that these men were simply fellow soldiers, participants in a shared tradition of warfare, became harder to accept without question. Even though not all officers were directly involved in the operation of camps like Ohrdruf, they still were part of the structure that allowed such places to exist. They had served a regime that made these actions possible. And for many American soldiers and officers, that connection could not be ignored. The shift was not always loud or openly expressed. In many cases, it was quiet, internal, a change in how individuals perceived the enemy they had been fighting, but it was unmistakable. Where there had once been a degree of cautious respect, there was now distance. Where there had been a willingness to see the conflict as one between professional armies, there was now an awareness that something far more complex and far more troubling lay beneath the surface. For the German officers held in POW camps, this shift was not immediately explained to them. They continued, in many cases, to operate under the same assumptions they had held before. They expected that their rank would still carry weight, that their identity as officers would still command recognition. But the context had changed. American guards and officers, many of whom had now seen or heard first-hand accounts of the camps, began to view these prisoners differently. Interactions became more restrained, more formal in a procedural sense, but less accommodating on a personal level. The small gestures that might once have been extended out of professional courtesy became less frequent. It was not yet an organized policy, not a formal directive, but it was a clear shift in attitude. The discovery of Ohrdruf did more than expose a hidden part of the Nazi system. It disrupted the narrative that had allowed some to view the war as a conventional conflict between comparable forces. It introduced a moral dimension that could not be set aside, one that demanded a reassessment of what had come before. For many American soldiers, the experience created a lasting impression. It shaped how they spoke about the war, how they understood their role in it, and how they viewed those who had served on the other side. And for the German officers who still clung to the idea of a gentleman's war, it marked the beginning of a reality they could no longer avoid. Because from this point forward, the question was no longer just about rank, protocol, or tradition. It was about accountability, perception, and the weight of what had been uncovered. The illusion they had carried with them into captivity was beginning to fracture, and soon it would face a response that was not based on custom or courtesy, but on a deliberate decision to confront that illusion directly.
In the days and weeks following the discoveries in places like Ohrdruf, something within the American command structure began to harden. What had once been a matter of procedure, processing prisoners, maintaining order, following established conventions, was now influenced by a deeper awareness of what the war had truly been about. The shift was not chaotic or emotional on the surface. It was controlled, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. At the center of this change was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was known for his composure, his ability to manage complex alliances, and his steady leadership under pressure. He was not a man given to impulsive decisions or dramatic gestures, but what he had seen in the camps left a lasting impression, one that quietly reshaped how he believed the defeated German leadership should be treated. There would be no outbursts, no public displays of anger. Instead, there would be something far more precise, a calculated withdrawal of the very thing many German officers still expected: recognition. It began subtly. American soldiers were not instructed to mistreat prisoners. The rules of the Geneva Conventions were still to be followed. Prisoners would be fed, housed, and protected. There would be no physical abuse, no violation of international law. But within those boundaries, a new tone was set. Salutes were no longer given.
For German officers who had built their identity around rank and status, this was not a small detail. The salute, in their world, was a fundamental acknowledgement of authority. It was automatic, unquestioned, and deeply symbolic. To receive a salute was to be recognized, not just as an individual, but as a representative of a system. Now, that gesture was gone. American guards, many of them young men who only months earlier had been civilians, stood in front of captured generals and did not raise their hands. They gave orders plainly, without ceremony. They addressed prisoners in functional terms, not as honored counterparts, but as individuals under their control. At first, some German officers reacted with confusion. They corrected what they saw as breaches of protocol, reminding guards of their rank, expecting that the oversight would be fixed. When that did not happen, confusion often gave way to frustration. There are accounts of officers insisting, sometimes forcefully, that they were entitled to proper treatment. They pointed to their uniforms, their insignia, their years of service. They referenced the traditions of military conduct, the idea that even in defeat, certain standards should be upheld. But the responses they received were consistent and unyielding. Those standards, as they understood them, no longer applied. This was not a spontaneous reaction from individual soldiers. It was part of a broader understanding that had taken hold within the American command. The decision was not about revenge. It was about stripping away the illusion that these men still carried with them, the belief that they remained figures of authority deserving of deference. General George S. Patton, known for his aggressive leadership style and strong personality, also encountered these moments firsthand. Patton, a career soldier with a deep appreciation for military tradition, might have been expected to sympathize with the concept of professional respect between officers. But even he, shaped by the realities of the war and the discoveries that had come to light, did not extend the gestures many German officers anticipated. There are recorded instances where high-ranking German officials attempted to engage Patton in conversation, expecting a handshake, a mutual acknowledgement of status. What they often received instead was distance, brief, controlled interactions that made it clear the relationship had fundamentally changed. No handshake, no shared moment of recognition, just silence, or at most a minimal exchange of necessary words. For the German officers, this was more than a social slight. It was a direct challenge to their identity. Within the camps, the effects became increasingly visible. The internal hierarchies they had tried to maintain began to weaken. Without external validation, the authority of rank started to erode. Orders given by senior officers carried less weight when they were no longer reinforced by the structures that had once supported them. The absence of salutes, the lack of formal address, the refusal to acknowledge status, these were not random acts. They formed a pattern, one that gradually dismantled the framework these men relied on to understand themselves. Some officers attempted to resist this change, holding on to their routines, insisting on discipline among fellow prisoners, maintaining appearances as best they could. But others began to show signs of something different, a quiet realization that the world they had operated in no longer existed. The psychological impact was subtle but powerful. In war, defeat is often measured in territory lost, armies destroyed, governments overthrown. But here, another kind of defeat was taking place, one that could not be mapped or quantified. It was happening in small moments, in daily interactions, in the absence of gestures that once seemed insignificant but now carried enormous meaning. To be ignored when expecting recognition, to be treated as ordinary when one had always been set apart, to exist without the symbols that had defined a lifetime of service. For many of these officers, this was a form of confrontation they had not anticipated. They had prepared for surrender in a military sense, documents signed, weapons laid down, orders given. but they had not prepared for the loss of identity that came with it, and that loss was not accidental. Eisenhower's approach ensured that there would be no dramatic scenes, no overt humiliation that could be dismissed as emotional reaction. Instead, there was consistency, a calm, steady refusal to participate in the illusion of status, a quiet insistence that whatever these men were before, they were now simply prisoners. In this way, the response carried a kind of weight that words could not convey. It said that the war had not been a meeting of equals, that the system these officers represented had forfeited the claim to the traditions it once relied on, that respect in this context was not automatic, it had to be deserved, and in the eyes of those who had seen the camps, it was no longer something that could be freely given. The transformation was not immediate and it was not uniform, but it was undeniable. The gentleman's war these officers believed in was no longer being acknowledged, not in policy, not in practice, not even in the smallest gestures. And in that silence, in that absence of recognition, something within them began to break.
By the time the war in Europe officially came to an end in May 1945, the physical conflict had stopped. But for many of the captured German officers, something far more personal was still unfolding. The battles were over, the orders had ceased, and the structure they had once commanded no longer existed. What remained was a quiet, unavoidable confrontation with a reality they had spent months resisting. Inside the prisoner of war camps, life settled into routine. Days were structured, controlled, predictable. Food was distributed, counts were taken, rules were enforced. On the surface, it was orderly, but beneath that order, a deeper transformation continued to take place, one that had little to do with physical conditions and everything to do with identity. For the officers who had once stood at the top of a rigid hierarchy, the change was profound. The symbols that had defined them, rank, authority, recognition, had not just been removed, they had been rendered meaningless. No one saluted them. No one deferred to them outside of the limited internal structures they tried to maintain among fellow prisoners. Even those structures began to weaken over time as the reality of their situation became harder to ignore. Some tried to hold on. They continued to wear their uniforms with precision, kept their posture rigid, insisted on discipline in small, controlled ways. They spoke as if their roles still carried weight, as if the world beyond the barbed wire would one day restore what had been lost. In conversations, they framed the war in familiar terms: strategy, duty, sacrifice, avoiding the larger questions that now surrounded it. But the environment around them no longer supported those beliefs. American guards remained consistent in their approach. There was no cruelty, no overt hostility, but also no validation. Orders were given plainly. Interactions were functional. The absence of recognition persisted day after day until it was no longer a shock, but a constant presence. And over time, that presence began to have an effect. For some officers, the realization came gradually. It appeared in small moments: hesitation before giving an order that no longer carried authority, a pause when expecting a gesture that never came, a growing awareness that the identity they had relied on could not survive in this new context. For others, the shift was more abrupt. There are accounts describing changes in behavior: officers who became quieter, more withdrawn, less certain in their interactions. The confidence that had once defined them gave way to something more subdued. Conversations that had once been filled with certainty became cautious, reflective, sometimes even defensive. The psychological impact was not uniform, but it was widespread. What made it particularly powerful was its simplicity. There was no need for confrontation, no need for argument. The message was delivered through consistency, through what was not done, what was not said, what was no longer acknowledged. The absence of a salute, the refusal of a handshake, the lack of recognition.
Each of these, on its own, might have seemed minor. Together, over time, they formed something much more significant. They dismantled the illusion. The idea of a gentleman's war, of mutual respect between professional soldiers regardless of outcome, depended on shared acknowledgement. It required both sides to agree, even implicitly, that they operated within the same moral and cultural framework. But that agreement no longer existed. For the American soldiers and officers who had seen the camps, who had witnessed the consequences of the system these men had served, the framework itself had been broken. The gestures that once symbolized respect could not be separated from the reality that had been uncovered, and so they were withheld, not out of impulse, but out of decision. For the German officers, this created a kind of silence that was difficult to confront. There was no direct accusation in these daily interactions, no explicit condemnation spoken in every exchange, but the absence itself carried meaning. It suggested a judgment that did not need to be stated aloud. Some resisted that implication, holding firmly to their interpretation of events, maintaining that they had acted as soldiers following orders, that the larger actions of the regime were separate from their own responsibilities. Others began to quietly question those assumptions. The camps became a space where these internal conflicts played out, not in dramatic confrontations, but in thought, in conversation, in the gradual adjustment to a reality that offered no easy resolution. As time passed, the war began to be documented, analyzed, and remembered. Evidence gathered from places like Ohrdruf and countless other sites would form the basis of a historical record that could not be easily denied. Trials would follow, testimonies would be given, and the narrative of the war would expand far beyond the battlefield. For the men who had once expected to be remembered as honorable participants in a traditional conflict, this presented a difficult truth. History would not see them only as soldiers. It would see them as part of a system. And within the quiet confines of the camps, long before many of those larger processes fully unfolded, that realization had already begun to take shape. The final defeat for many of these officers was not marked by the moment they surrendered their weapons. It came later, in the slow erosion of the identity they had carried for so long, in the recognition that the respect they expected would not return, in the understanding that the world they believed in had not just been defeated, it had been rejected. No speeches announced it, no formal declarations defined it. It existed in the silence, in the absence, in the simple refusal to acknowledge what they once were. And in that silence, the illusion finally disappeared.